thing that Thorndike picked up on?
So the crucial observation, and this is really the foundation of understanding habit formation,
Yeah.
was this: actions that led to a satisfying result became way more likely to get repeated.
Okay.
He kept really detailed records of how long it took each cat to escape
Right.
over multiple attempts.
Okay.
And he noticed, for example, one cat number 12,
All right.
took a whopping 160 seconds to get out on its first try.
Wow.
But after like 20 or 30 tries,
Right.
that time plummeted to just a few seconds.
That's a huge difference.
I know, right? It's remarkable.
It went from like almost 3 minutes of struggling to bam, they're out.
Yeah.
Just like that.
And this pattern was consistent across all the different cats he tested. It wasn't that they suddenly had some big epiphany.
Yeah.
They were gradually learning which actions led to the reward,
Right.
which in this case was escape and food.
Okay.
So his conclusion was that habits form through this process of repetition and positive reinforcement.
Okay.
You know, getting something good as a result of your actions, the more often an action was rewarded,
Right.
the more ingrained it became.
So it wasn't so much that the cat like intellectually understood how the lash worked or whatever. It was just that feeling of freedom
Yep.
and then the taste of that food. That was enough to really hardwire that lever-pressing behavior.
Exactly. It's like, you know, the cat's brain was saying, hey, this works. This feels good. Let's do this again.
Right. And we're not so different, are we?
Not really.
I mean, this kind of shows a fundamental way that our brains operate, right?
For sure.
We're programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Yeah, anything that triggers positive outcomes.
Right.
Our brain's like, okay, that's valuable. File that away for later.
Makes sense. So this trial and error learning in the puzzle box.
Yeah.
How does that connect to why our brains even bother developing habits in the first place?
That's a great question.
Like, why go through all that trouble?
Well, it comes down to efficiency.
Okay.
When we encounter a brand new situation, our brains have to work really hard.
Right.
Think back to Thorndike's cat.
Okay.
In that box, for the first time, it's in full-on analysis mode.
Yeah.
What is this place? What can I do? How do I get out here?
Right.
There's a lot of neural activity going on as it's testing different solutions.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being totally overwhelmed when you're faced with something completely new.
Exactly.
Just trying to figure out where to even start.
Right.
Now, contrast that with a habit that's already well established.
Okay.
When your brain recognizes a familiar situation,
Yeah.
it can basically skip all that initial heavy lifting.
Yep. It recognizes the pattern and just fires off the pre-programmed response.
Yeah.
Which dramatically reduces what we call cognitive load.
Right.
The amount of mental effort required.
I was thinking it's kind of like the difference between having to like consciously spell out every word when you're typing
Okay.
versus just touch typing.
Right.
One takes way more focus and concentration. The other is practically automatic.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Actually, the chapter we read even uses an example of this.
Oh, yeah.
Like, imagine you've had a long, stressful day.
Okay.
You might automatically reach for your video game controller without even thinking
Right.
about other ways to unwind.
Yeah,
That's an automatic habit in action.
totally.
Habits become these mental shortcuts built on solutions that have worked for us in the past.
Yeah.
So they're all about making life easier for your brain.
So our brains are kind of lazy.
Well, they're efficient.
Yeah, they're efficient.
They like to conserve energy.
Okay. And from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
It's a big advantage.
Yeah, because by automating routine behaviors, our conscious attention is freed up to focus on new situations,
Yeah.
potential dangers, more complex tasks.
Right. We need that bandwidth.
We do imagine if you had to consciously think through every single step of making your morning coffee,
Oh, my God.
you wouldn't have much mental energy left for anything else.
That's a good point.
Yeah, habits are essential.
So habits, these automated sequences that our brains develop to save energy.
Right.
But let's break down how these sequences actually work.
Okay.
The material we looked at talks about this four-step pattern that's often called the habit loop.
Yeah, the habit loop.
Fill us in on that.
So the habit loop is basically the blueprint of every habit.
Okay.
It's a continuous cycle with 4 key stages:
All right.
cue, craving, response, and reward.
Okay, so let's go through them one by one, starting with the cue. What is that exactly?
So the cue is the trigger that kicks off the whole behavior.
Okay.
It's a piece of information that signals to your brain, hey, a reward might be coming your way.
All right.
And these cues can be all sorts of things.
Like,
Well, a specific time of day,
okay.
a certain location,
Uh-huh.
an action you just did,
Right.
your emotional state, even the presence of another person.
Okay.
The important thing about the cue is that it creates this sense of predictability and anticipation of a reward.
Right.
whether you're consciously aware of it or not.
Interesting.
Think about how seeing your running shoes by the door might cue your brain that it's time for your morning run.
Yeah.
The power is in recognizing and manipulating these cues.
Okay, so the cue is like the when, where, or what that starts the whole process.
Exactly.
Got it.
Comes next.
Next up is the craving.
Okay.
And this is the motivational force behind the habit.
Right.
It's the desire for that reward.
Okay.
But it's really important to understand that we don't necessarily crave the habit itself, but rather the feeling or the satisfaction that the habit delivers.
I see.
For example, someone might crave the feeling of stress relief that comes from smoking a cigarette,
Right.
not necessarily the act of inhaling smoke itself.
Cravings are all about the desired emotional state.
That's a really important point. It's not about the habit itself. It's about the underlying need or desire that the habit is trying to fulfill.
Exactly.
So the cue triggers the craving. Then what happens?
And then comes the response, which is the actual habit you perform.
Okay.
This could be a physical action, a thought pattern, or even choosing not to do something.
Okay.
And whether or not you actually carry out the response depends on two things:
What are they?
your level of motivation and your ability to do it.
Makes sense.
If the response requires too much effort, or if you don't have the skills to do it,
Right.
the habit's probably not going to stick.
So if the desire isn't strong enough to outweigh the effort it takes to actually do the thing, then the loop stalls out.
Pretty much.
Okay. And finally, we get to the reward.
Yes, the reward.
This is the good stuff.
It's the satisfaction you experience from performing the habit,
Right.
and the reward actually serves two critical functions.
Okay.
First, it satisfies the craving, and second, and maybe even more important for habit formation,
Yeah.
it teaches your brain which actions are worth remembering.
Right.
It strengthens that connection between the cue, the response, and that feeling of satisfaction.
So the reward is what closes the loop
Exactly.
and makes it more likely that the same cue will trigger the same craving and response again in the future.
Right, it's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Like a feedback loop.
Yep. The reward reinforces the behavior,
Okay.
making it more and more automatic over time.
Got it. The material we're looking at also mentions this idea of viewing the habit loop as a problem-solving process.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Okay, so think of the first two stages.
Cue and craving.
Yep, the cue and the craving as the problem phase.
The problem phase.
Yeah, the cue signals that something in your internal or external environment needs attention.
Okay.
And the craving is your brain saying, hey, I want to change my current state to something more desirable.
Okay, so the cue kind of flags the problem or the situation, and the craving is the urge to find a solution.
Exactly.
All right, then what about the response and the reward?
Well, they become the solution phase.
The solution phase.
The response is the action you take to address that craving.
Okay.
And the reward is the feeling of satisfaction you get when the craving is satisfied.
Right.
The problem's solved. Your internal state has shifted in a positive direction.
I like that that's a helpful way to think about it. Can you give us some real-world examples of this habit loop in action as a problem-solving process?
Sure, so imagine your phone vibrates in your pocket.
Okay.
That's the cue.
The cue.
Right, and you immediately want to know who's texting you and what they want.
Yeah.
That's the craving, the desire to fill that information gap.
Okay.
So you pull out your phone and check the notification.
That's the response.
That's the response, and the satisfaction of knowing what the message says is the reward.
Oh.
Your brain then strengthens the association between your phone vibrating and the reward of information.
It all clicks into place.
It does.
What's another example?
How about this? Someone sits down to work at their computer
Okay.
and sees a ton of emails in their inbox.
Playa. Been there.
That's the cue, right? And they start to feel stressed and overwhelmed by all those messages.
Right.
That's the craving, the desire to get rid of that negative feeling.
Okay.
So the response might be to check social media for a few minutes.
Procrastination.
Right. But that temporary distraction, that little mental escape, provides a small reward.
Right.
So the urge to check social media becomes linked to that cue of feeling overwhelmed by emails.
Even though checking social media might actually make them less productive in the long run,
It might.
in that moment it offers a bit of relief.
Exactly.
One more example.
Sure. How about this? You wake up in the morning and see sunlight streaming through the window.
Okay.
That's the cue.
The cue.
And you crave that feeling of alertness and being ready to start the day.
Okay.
That's the craving.
The craving.
So you head to the kitchen and make a cup of coffee. The response and the feeling of increased alertness plus the taste of the coffee is the reward.
Got it. So this four-step loop is running all the time behind the scenes,
Yeah.
shaping so much of what we do. But how can we actually use this knowledge
Right.
to build better habits and break the bad ones?
That's the key question.
Well, the material we're looking at talks about something called the 4 laws of behavior change.
Yeah, those are great.
What can you tell us about those?
So these 4 laws are basically practical strategies that come directly from the habit loop.
Okay.
They give us a clear, actionable framework for consciously designing good habits and breaking bad ones.
Okay, so how do we use them to build good habits?
Well, for building good habits, each law addresses one of the stages of the habit loop directly.
Got it. So let's break it down.
Okay, so the first law focuses on the cue, and it's to make it obvious.
Make it obvious.
You want to make the cues for your desired habits super visible and easy to notice in your environment.
Makes sense. So like if you're trying to build a reading habit,
Yeah,
leaving a book open on your nightstand is a pretty obvious cue.
exactly.
Okay, what about the second law?
So the second law targets the craving,
Yeah,
and it's to make it attractive.
make it attractive. Okay,
The more appealing a habit is, the stronger your desire to do it will be.
right.
So this could mean linking the habit with positive emotions,
Okay.
associating it with things you already enjoy, or even joining communities where the desired behavior is the norm.
I see. So if you want to exercise more consistently,
Yeah.
maybe find a workout buddy who you actually like spending time with.
Exactly.
So going to the gym becomes more appealing.
That's the idea.
Okay.
What's the third law?
The third law relates to the response, and it's to make it easy.
Make it easy.
The simpler a habit is to perform,
Right.
the more likely you are to actually do it.
Yeah.
So this often means reducing friction, minimizing the steps involved,
Okay.
and making the initial commitment really small.
So like laying out your workout clothes the night before.
Yep.
So there's one less obstacle in
Yeah.
the morning. That's a great example.
Okay. And the fourth law,
The fourth law addresses the reward, and it's to make it satisfying.
make it satisfying.
When the reward you get after doing a habit is immediate and enjoyable,
Yeah.
your brain's going to want to repeat that behavior.
Right.
This could involve tracking your progress visually,
Okay.
celebrating small milestones, or just finding some intrinsic enjoyment in the habit itself.
So design for positive reinforcement.
Exactly.
Okay. Those 4 laws for building good habits seem pretty straightforward.
Yeah, they are.
But what about breaking bad habits?
Right.
Do these principles work in reverse?
That's where we use the inversion of each law.
Inversion.
Yeah, to break a bad habit, you essentially do the opposite of what you do to build a good one.
Okay.
So for the first law, make it obvious.
Right.
The inversion is to make it invisible.
Make it invisible.
Reduce your exposure to the cues that trigger that unwanted habit.
Okay, so if you're trying to cut back on mindless snacking,
Yeah.
that might mean clearing all the junk food out of your pantry. So you're not constantly tempted.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. Okay, so what about the second law, make it attractive? How do we invert that?
Well, the inversion is to make it unattractive.
Make it unattractive.
Highlight the negative consequences of the bad habit
Right.
and try to consciously link it with bad feelings or outcomes.
So like if you're trying to quit smoking,
Yeah,
you might remind yourself of all the health risks every time you get a craving.
that's the idea.
Okay. The third law is make it easy. What's the inversion there?
Make it difficult.
Make it difficult.
Increase the friction, the effort it takes to perform that bad habit.
Okay.
Put obstacles in your own way.
So if I'm trying to cut back on social media,
Yeah,
I could delete the apps from my phone.
exactly.
So it takes more effort to access them.
Makes it less tempting.
Right. And finally, the fourth law, make it satisfying. What's the opposite of that?
Make it unsatisfying.
Make it unsatisfying.
Find ways to make the bad habit unpleasant or introduce negative consequences.
Okay.
Even if they're small ones.
Like maybe every time you give in to the bad habit, you have to put $5 in a jar
Yeah,
that you're going to donate to a cause you don't support.
that's a good one.
Something like that.
Yeah, the key takeaway here is that understanding these 4 laws and how they work with the habit loop gives you this incredibly powerful toolkit.
A toolkit.
Yeah, for changing your behavior.
Taking control.
Exactly. It's like you're not at the mercy of your habits anymore.
Right.
You're the architect.
You're the architect.
You get to design them.
This is so empowering. It's like you're saying habit change doesn't have to be this constant struggle.
Right.
It's more strategic.
It is.
It's about design.
Exactly.
But one thing I've heard people say about habits is that they can feel kind of restrictive.
Oh, yeah.
Like you're losing some of your freedom.
Yeah, get that.
What's the perspective on that in the stuff we've been looking at?
So there's this misconception that habits box us in,
Right.
but actually good habits, well-designed ones, create more freedom in our lives.
Okay.
Think about it.
I'm listening.
By automating essential tasks and routines, you free up so much mental energy
Yeah.
and cognitive resources,
Okay.
which you can then use for creative pursuits,
Right.
for working towards bigger goals,
Yeah.
for dealing with unexpected challenges.
So instead of being restrictive, positive habits actually free us up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Think about it this way.
Okay.
If you have strong, positive habits around managing your money,
Right.
you gain more financial freedom and security.
Okay.
If you have good habits relating to your health and fitness,
Yeah.
you enjoy more physical freedom and vitality.
That's true.
It's often the poorly managed, unconscious habits
Yeah.
that drain our energy and require constant willpower to resist.
Right. Yeah.
And that ends up limiting our freedom and potential.
Makes sense.
When the foundational stuff is taken care of efficiently
Right.
by positive habits,
Yeah.
your mind's free to focus on higher level thinking
Okay.
and doing the things you really value.
So it's about shifting the burden away from constant conscious decision making.
Right.
And handing it over to automated positive behaviors in the areas that are most important to us.
That's the goal.
So you're investing effort up front
Right.
to build those good habits,
Yeah.
but then you reap the rewards later.
Absolutely. More time,
Yeah.
more energy, more resources to pursue what really matters.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From Thorndike's puzzle boxes
Yeah.
to the habit loop
Yep.
to the 4 laws of behavior change.
Right.
Can you sum it all up for our listeners?
Okay, so the key takeaway is that habits are automatic behaviors that are formed through this neurological loop.
Right.
The cue, the craving, the response, and the reward.
Okay.
And this loop basically acts as a continuous problem-solving mechanism.
Okay.
When you understand each part of this loop
Uh-huh.
and you learn how to apply the 4 laws of behavior change,
Right.
making good habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying, while making bad habits invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying.
Yeah.
You basically have a powerful framework for shaping your habits.
For taking control.
Exactly.
So for you listening out there, here's something to think about.
Okay.
What's one small habit that you could intentionally design or redesign
Right.
starting today to move you closer to your goals?
Love that.
Really think about the cue that triggers that behavior or could trigger a new one,
Yeah.
the craving that it satisfies or that you want it to satisfy,
Uh-huh.
the response itself,
Right.
and the reward you currently get
Okay.
or could design.
I like it.
How are those elements playing out in your life right now?
Yeah.
And what small, deliberate adjustments could you make to nudge that habit in a more positive direction?
That's a great question to ask yourself.
I think so too. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the science of habits.
It's a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Sounds good.